Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. Today we're continuing our study of the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread found in Exodus chapter 12. We'll be picking it up in verse 14 and continuing on through verse 20. But before I read today's passage, I wanted to give you an idea of the overall structure of the chapter. There's a logic behind how the chapter unfolds, and I think it's helpful to zero in on what that is. So verses 1 through 20 of Exodus 12 are where God addresses Moses and Aaron for the sake of the whole congregation. So they're getting their instructions from God. And then verses 21 through 27 are where Moses actually addresses the Israelite elders. He passes along Yahweh's instruction. So then within each of those two sections, God talking and Moses talking, the material divides into two parts. So verses 1 through 13 have to do with the Passover in Egypt. So God is telling Moses and Aaron how to celebrate the Passover in Egypt. And then in verses 14 through 20, which is our passage for today, God is addressing Moses and Aaron to talk about how to celebrate the Passover outside of Egypt, how to commemorate the work that God did in Egypt, and how to do it annually. That's also true of the second chunk of text, verses 21 through 27. 21 through 23 are Moses addressing the Israelite elders about the Passover in Egypt, giving instructions for the actual initial event. And verses 24 through 27 are Moses addressing the elders about how to commemorate the Passover and continue to celebrate it outside of Egypt in years to come. So I think this is helpful to kind of orient us to where we are. And you'll find this is true of lots of ritual texts. There's a logic behind the order. And if you just sit with it and ask yourself, who's speaking to whom? What is the topic of these instructions? What is the scope? Is it something to do right now? Is it something to do in the future? These are the kinds of questions that can help us begin to make sense of how a text is unfolding. The point of this is that Yahweh's deliverance is not just a one-time event. It's meant to be commemorated year after year so that every generation will have a vivid sense of having experienced God's rescue. So it's not just one generation that's rescued from Egypt. If we celebrate the Passover year after year, every generation will own this story and understand it to be their story. So it's really theologically significant. All right, let me read our passage. This is my translation from the Hebrew, starting in verse 14. This day will be a memorial for you. You shall hold a festival for Yahweh. For your descendants, as a lasting ordinance, you shall hold the feast. 7 days of flatbread you shall eat. Indeed, on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from Israel, from the first day until the seventh day. On the first day there will be a holy assembly for you, and on the seventh day there will be a holy assembly for you. No work shall be done on them, except what each person eats. That alone you may do for yourselves. You shall keep the Feast of Flatbread, for on this very day I brought your armies out from the land of Egypt. So you shall keep this day for your descendants as a lasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, you shall eat flatbread, until the 21st day of the month in the evening. 7 days leaven must not be found in your houses. For anyone who eats leaven, that person shall be cut off from the assembly of Israel, whether immigrant or citizen of the land. All that is leavened you must not eat. In all your dwellings you shall eat flatbread. Okay, what is going on here? Why flatbread? Why unleavened bread is to be eaten? Well, first of all, in the original event, the reason the Israelites ate flatbread is because there wasn't time to let the dough rise. They ate the Passover meal in haste, dressed and ready to leave. So there was no leisure to sit and let the dough rise before they left. Later, the prohibition of leavened bread is so that they can reenact this hurried departure from Egypt. What's really interesting to me is to think about how leaven worked in ancient Israel. Because if you're like me, when I say yeast, you think of the little jars of yeast that you can buy at the grocery store, and you take a tablespoon or a couple of teaspoons and put it in your bread recipe, and it makes the bread rise. And I've always wondered, like, why do they have to throw all that away every year when they're celebrating? Well, ancient Israelites didn't have little jars of yeast. What they did to leaven their bread was more like what we do if you think of a sourdough starter. They would take some unbaked dough. So when they made their dough, they would not bake all of it. They would set aside some of the dough and mix it in with tomorrow's dough, and the leaven, the fermentation of the first day's dough, would then ferment and help the second day's dough rise. So to say no leaven must be found in your houses means that they would, rather than setting some of the dough aside from one day's bread for the next day, they would just bake all of it and eat all of it. So I doubt there was a lot of waste in the average Israelite home. I doubt they were throwing out very much. It was more a matter of preparing by baking everything and eating all of it, enjoying all of it. And they're not supposed to be setting aside any for tomorrow to make tomorrow's bread rise better. And the significance of that seems to be they are leaving Egypt behind. And they're not supposed to take any of what they had in Egypt with them. Like, none of that dough comes with them in the wilderness to leaven their next dough. There's a clean break, and they're starting fresh with a new batch of dough without any of yesterday's dough. So the point of this is to leave the past behind, to leave Egypt in Egypt, and to completely start over. There's a very harsh sentence for those who don't follow this, for those who sneak a little bit of yesterday's dough into their bread to make it rise. There's a harsh penalty. They're to be cut off. So what does it mean to be cut off from Israel? There's two possibilities here. It could mean banishment, like someone is actually sent out of the community and they're no longer a member of the community, or it could indicate the death penalty. They're cut off from life itself. Now, there's debate about whether in this case being cut off is permanent or temporary. Obviously, if it was the death penalty, it would be permanent. But if someone is banished from the community, it's possible, and William Propp thinks that this is the case, it's possible that they're only cut off for the week, for those 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They have lost their privilege of participating in this festival. That's one possible way of understanding it here. Throughout, you can do a search for this idea of being cut off, and there are various infractions that would result in someone being cut off from Israel. The point is that they would not get to participate either permanently or temporarily. Nahum Sarna, a Jewish commentator on Exodus, explains it this way. He says the general idea is that one who deliberately excludes himself from the religious community of Israel cannot be a beneficiary of the covenantal blessings, and thereby dooms himself and his line to extinction. So by choosing to keep leavened bread, keep dough to leaven the next bread, and not obey God's instructions here, they're choosing to exclude themselves from the blessings of covenant membership. Moses addresses future generations in this passage as if the Passover and the Exodus have already taken place. These instructions are clearly for future generations. He calls this a lasting ordinance. There are 10 places in the Hebrew Bible where something is called a lasting ordinance. So for fun, you can search that in an online Bible. Just search for lasting ordinance and see how many of these you can locate. This passage is full of wordplay. There are lots of, I suspect this is true in other ritual texts as well, although I haven't explored it. There's lots of repeated sounds, repeated mouth sounds that make it sound sort of Dr. Seuss-y as you read certain sentences in it. These instructions are very beautifully crafted, and we kind of miss that in English. Finally, just a word about the calendar. They are supposed to start counting from day one. Day one is the day of instructions. That's when the calendar begins. Day 10, they set aside a lamb. And then day 14 is the day that they celebrate the Passover and kick off the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts for 7 days until day 21. So if day 1 is a Sunday, or beginning Saturday night and into Sunday, if you count a day from evening to morning, then the Passover itself takes place on the Sabbath, and then the final Feast of Unleavened Bread also takes place on the Sabbath. As the calendar unfolds, their sacred time is being marked by the memory of God's deliverance from Egypt. And they're supposed to completely rest, to make margin in their lives, to absorb and reflect on the miracle that God has done on their behalf. The only work they're allowed to do is the work that is required to prepare and eat food during that 7 days. Other than that, they're supposed to rest on the first and last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Is a Sabbath rest. So I hope this has been interesting. In the next videos, we'll look at Moses' instructions to the elders as they carry it forward. But I think it's worth considering many Christians today do not take rest, Sabbath rest, seriously, and do not take festivals seriously. And I think it's important for us to consider God pauses this epic narrative in Exodus to institute this festival because he doesn't want the people to forget what he has done. And I think it's worth considering the ways that we could recenter in our corporate experience, in our family life, the regular celebration of what God has done, that we would push pause on our daily life and on our hamster wheel of activities, and we would step off and we would take time to reflect on the miracle of God's deliverance. All right, with that in mind, have a great week.